well before the WisDOT TIPO project, there was not a relationship between the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers and the Department of Transportation.
What relationship there wasn't good. And it wasn't only perhaps just with the tribes, but to a certain degree, historically, the Department of Transportation sort of had a reputation of coming in saying, we're the DOT, this is what we're going to do, and that's that.
In my opinion, it wasn't important. And a lot of projects were slipping through the cracks. There were a lot of issues with our concerns not being addressed and not being taken seriously.
The department, and primarily the project managers, would send out a notification letter that addressed their consultation needs. And as I think we all have heard, notification is not necessarily consultation. And it's like, we got that.
I feel like from this side of the table, which is the agency side of the table and the professional archaeology side of the table, there was always the fear of doing or saying the wrong thing, being insensitive, and because of that, there was a fear of actually addressing those things and talking to people. So I think there was a lot of fear and just a general misunderstanding and lack of communication in general.
Prior to the partnership agreement, I mean, that's what inspired the partnership agreement, was that nobody was listening to anybody.
Before we had this, the project, we would do what was absolutely necessary by law, which meant a letter to the tribal chair if we had any intentions of doing a project on or near the reservation. And we saw it more like a courtesy. We weren't waiting for any input back from the tribe. We were just telling you we were going to be there.
The tribes wanted to be at the table with them, wanted to implement a government-to-government relationship, and it just wasn't happening. We were still, I think, placed in this position of subservient kind of position where we didn't count, we didn't matter. And it wasn't until somebody mentioned a few laws to them that they weren't in compliance with that they sort of looked at it differently and thought, oh, well, you know, this could happen to us, so we better listen to what they have to say.
We have some amazing people in our office that work amazingly well with the tribes, and then we have some people who just don't always get it, and so you have to take that extra time and talk to them and try to come up with examples, trying to bring it home to them, which isn't always easy because as non-natives they may not have that same kind of cultural tie to their land.
Underneath the Doyle administration, I think was instrumental in moving this project forward to where we're at today with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation and the 11 tribes of Wisconsin. And from day one, we've always had a lot of participation in the early days because it was something new. It was something that the government or the state government was going to come to the tribes. And I think that we grasped it wholeheartedly and saying, hey, this is a true effort of consultation. First time. A lot of times the tribal nations have to go to the state or to the federal government, okay, and knock on doors. Well, underneath the Doyle administration, the doors, come on in, tribes. Let's see what we can do.
We're actually talking, and I think one of the things that the TIPOs made real clear early on was that early and meaningful consultation was what's really important. You know, we used to come in and if we talked to them at all, it was basically right before the bulldozers were ready to come out and do a project. Now more and more we're talking to them years and years in advance of a project ever happening. So you know, we're working with tribes on what I call a shared vision for the highways that go through reservation, that it's going to work from the state perspective, that we're allowing safe and efficient transportation for people through Wisconsin, but also it's their community. It's got to work for them because that's their home as well. And while we make a road, we're then out of there. They're going to live with that roadway for the next 15, 20, 30 years.
DOT invited our input, and believe it or not, the tribes actually wrote the policy. I mean, we went through step by step and said, you know, step one, contact tribes. Step two, you know, talk to tribes about, you know, what could be impacted as a result of the project. Oh, imagine that. Very early in the process, we're going to ask tribes if they have concerns.
That was an interesting process in itself there. When it first was brought to WITC, for example, and the TIPOs, and all the parties that worked on it through the years, it ended up stretching a little bit there. It looked to me as that something that was very unorganized. And I shouldn't say unorganized. It involved a lot of things there, so it had to be set out at a certain way.
There's things that we know that we can share with WisDOT, that we can keep on going and use the technology and the things that they have, work it together, and we could have a great system here.
It completely changed the dynamics, but the tribes themselves wrote the policy. Now granted, when it got to the agency for review, there were a lot of changes, but the spirit of those changes still is within Chapter 26. And now we are just starting to learn how to implement that policy. So while writing everything and putting everything down in writing, the best way to work with tribes was step number one. We have the true work, which is going to be actually implementing a policy that I imagine is going to be met with some resistance, because it is a lot more work. It's a lot more people engagement, which I think that, you know, in transportation in general and industry is about, you know, get to, you know, A and B as quickly as possible, both physically and, you know, in the design process.
I think it made it a more efficient tool to use, and it does save the DOT on the other end dollars, in that if they, you know, involve the consultation process early, it could help avoid certain sites that could stop a project whole soul, you know. So that's, I think, is kind of big. That development process of that document, though, was big in that it does show that, you know, state agencies and federal groups, you know, like tribes, and even other interest groups and preservation groups actually can sit down and mesh out something that actually works for everybody.
I think this is a real opportunity to be a model for throughout the U.S. in order to work on a government-to-government level. You know, we're just, and I think that WisDOT's just starting to understand we're not just a county government or a state government or a city government or anything like that. We're a tribal government, and our government has been here forever, forever. I think it's a lot better. It's a lot better. I think that there's a greater understanding of where we're coming from, the tribes, and where we've been at. Also, I think there's beginning to be an understanding of where we want to be at, and not as just the tribes, but collectively with the state of Wisconsin.
The completely unique thing about the efforts that, you know, really were undertaken between the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers in Wisconsin and DOT is that we really did the tribes identified the policy, examined the policy, and said, this is exactly why you're not working with us effectively.
Where our ancestors are buried, there's known areas and there's unknown areas. The Tribal Historic Preservation Officers of each tribe, through oral tradition and or maps or anything else that they have on hand that has never been given either to the state or the federal government, but it has been handed down within their tribes, and that's where the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers play a big role in what's going on.
It started really rough. I mean, to the point of, you know, sitting face to face this far away and me standing up and pounding on my desk and letting them know that they couldn't go through a certain section of land that it was a historic property. In our perspective, it was a significant historic property to us that needed to be protected. And we needed to make provisions for that. And they were adamant in telling me, well, no, it's already planned, we're gonna do it next year, you know? And I'm like, no, you're not. And they're like, yes, we are. I said, no, you're not. And they were like, yes, we are. I said, no, you're not. Unless you want half this reservation standing on Highway 2, shutting it down, it is not gonna happen.
We are largely not recognized, I would say, in a secular society as representatives of our own culture and people. Becoming a TIPO, we feel it was like our next step in order to become recognized or become a player, you know, in the preservation aspects in ancestral areas that, you know, Ho-Chunk can lay claim to.
Just knowing myself, I mean, riding in the car when I'm 8 years old with my grandmother, and she's pointing over to this area of land because we live right nearby. We're right at the intersection there. And my grandmother telling me, okay, people are buried there. And I'm like, where? Under the highway. I'm like, what? You'll know when you get older.
Well, I think maybe the key thing, and while it sounds simple, is they asked us to say we were sorry. And like in any relationship, maybe the toughest thing to do is to say, I'm sorry.
This isn't just an artifact, or, you know, a lot of archaeologists, there was a discussion yesterday about how archaeologists focus on artifacts and things, and when you go out with someone like Dave, you know it's not just an artifact or a thing. It's an emotional tie to the land. It's the heritage and their history, and there's a real spirit to the land there.
When you pull a tribal elder to the table, you put them across from a DOT official and they're wearing their suit and tie and, you know, have got their book and their binder and their policy in front of them. I guarantee the tribal elder across the table is not going to be reading from a piece of paper. They're going to be talking from here. And they want to talk to someone that can listen from here.
Cultural resources and all those things that are good things aside, why should an agency do this? It's good business. It's good for the taxpayer, it's good for the motorist, and it's good for the people who appreciate our environment and those historic and cultural features that make Wisconsin and the upper Midwest the place that people want to live.
I look at this to continue for perpetuity, you know, for our young people that come into the tribal historic preservation or underneath the current councils, that they continue to send representatives and keep the process of consultation open. The door is open, and we got to keep that door open.
I think the real benefit is just establishing relationships and helping people understand. I mean, we are able to get more and more project managers out who then get somewhat more of an appreciation of where people are coming from. Because, you know, life on a reservation is somewhat different than life in a small town in Wisconsin. You know, we're all going to cheer for the Packers. But when we get into our homes, we look at things a little bit differently.
But the reality is that I'd like to think that other agencies within the state of Wisconsin and other agencies outside of the state of Wisconsin would see the true value in building relationships with tribes. Wisconsin has an amazing model. They have a tribal affairs structure that I have not seen in another agency. We have regional tribal liaisons, we have statewide tribal liaisons, but we also have an ethic that we're building that teaches our staff and agency that working with tribes makes for more efficient projects, makes for more effective relationships, and in the end, being efficient and effective is the language that every agency wants to hear.